There was one other thing that we wanted to talk to you about, Ross. A campaign was launched yesterday by the Department of Health here. It's called Zero Gains, and it's to try and counteract what they say is widespread steroid use amongst Irish gym goers. The target is particularly Irish teenagers, but I mean it applies to largely, it seems, young males in their 20s and 30s. Now, I know of stories where there are amateur cyclists getting completely off their heads on drugs to try and win races on a weekend. This seems to be a fairly widespread global phenomenon at the moment.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. In South Africa, there's been every single year, there's some scandal around schoolboys and doping. There was a big study done where they surveyed 10,000 schoolboys in South Africa a few years back, and they found a lifetime prevalence of 10%. So basically 1 in 10 schoolboys will confess to doping. And you can imagine, even if half of them confess, the true number is 1 in 5. So it certainly is a big problem. And one of the most interesting things about that study, and I imagine it's very similar to what's happening in Ireland, is when they ask those people, why do you use the steroids, performance is one of the lesser factors. The main thing, the most common by a considerable amount, is for appearance and aesthetics and to look good. And so that gym-going population that has such easy access to drugs through the gym community, because that's where they get it from, is their peers and their colleagues and the trainers and so forth who are making a buck on the side, it's a massive issue. So I'm not sure how one deals with it. I'm not convinced that education is the most effective way to do it, but I certainly think a campaign for awareness is important.
So, as in, the best way would be to try and somehow cut down on the supply, like you think generally about the war on drugs and how insignificant the results have been for the investment, and just generally how criminalising people involved in it hasn't made any dent in the general population's willingness to take drugs. It's very hard to know what to do with this.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the reasons education often fails is because people are really terrible at making decisions today about the consequences that are delayed into the future. So in the 1980s and even the 70s, any campaign to tell people to not smoke because of the health risks of lung cancer, those were ineffective. The same thing now is you can tell someone, don't eat that burger and those extra large fries and a supersized Coke, because in 20 years' time you might get heart problems and liver disease and so forth. But people don't care about those because the outcome is so delayed. And one of the problems with anti-doping campaigns that focus on risk is that they're also trying to tell someone, don't do this because maybe in 10 years you'll see the consequences. That person is doping for the right now. They say, I want to look good in 2 weeks or 2 months. And so that's one of the problems, is trying to change behavior with that message. So that's not to say that it's not important to do, because I think if you're in a regulatory environment, maybe at some point you're saying we're never going to stop them from doping. So what we can do is we can educate and we can warn them so that we can suppress, lower the levels, and maybe where it was previously unsafe, we can bring it back down to what's a safe level, and that in itself is a win. So perhaps that's how we need to think a little bit about it. But the eradication of drug use through education, for me, is folly.